What is it like to find a sword abandoned by the god of war? Not on the battlefield, but in a pool of blood that has not yet cooled. It was heavier than the boy could lift, but it seemed lighter than the burden he had taken upon his shoulders. And if this sword had been forgotten, who was its owner? And what would happen if he returned to claim it? The storm had already swallowed the sun when the boy found the sword. Lightning stitched the sky, and each white flash carved the battlefield into stark relief. Broken shields, trampled wheat, and a single hand still clutching a banner no wind could lift. The air stank of wet earth and wetter iron. Blood so fresh it steamed when the rain touched it. Cale crouched beneath the axle of an overturned cart, ribs heaving. He was 12, maybe 13, nobody had kept count since the famine began. Hunger had hollowed him, but fear sharpened every sense. Another roll of thunder, and the field lit up again. There, half buried in churned mud, lay a sword. It was wrong to notice beauty here, yet he did. The blade was longer than his arm, its fuller catching the lightning like a vein of quicksilver. Rain hissed where it struck the steel, turning to ghost steam. When Cale wrapped both hands around the grip, the leather was still warm, alive almost, as if someone had just let it fall. He should have run. Raiders combed these fields for anything worth selling: boots, rings, teeth. Instead, he dragged the sword free with a wet sucking sound and staggered under its weight. The point scraped furrows in the mud behind him, leaving a trail as clear as spilled ink. The cart creaked overhead, water dripping through broken planks onto the back of his neck. He tasted copper on the air and realized it wasn't just rain running into his mouth. Somewhere close, a man was bleeding. A broken moan rode the wind, low, animal, but undeniably human. Cale's grip tightened until his knuckles cracked. The sword trembled in his fists, as if eager to return to whatever hand had dropped it. He followed the sound through a thicket of shattered lances. Each step squelched. Each heartbeat sounded louder than the storm. At the edge of the clearing, lightning struck a dead oak, and for one blinding instant he saw the night. The man lay against the tree's blackened roots, mail shirt split open like a gutted fish. Blood pulsed from a gash along his ribs, painting the bark in slow, deliberate strokes. His helm was gone. Rain matted dark hair to a pale forehead. One gauntlet hand clutched empty air where the sword should have been. Cale's breath caught. He knew the crest on the torn surcoat, silver hawk on midnight blue, the same hawk stitched on the banners that had once marched past his village promising protection. The knight's eyes, the color of storm clouds, opened and fixed on him. Neither moved. Rain drummed on steel, on skin, on the fragile space between them. Then the knight's cracked lips shaped a word too soft to hear, yet Cale felt it land inside his chest like a second heartbeat. The boy took one step forward, sword dragging, and the knight swallowed them both. The barn smelled of wet straw and old smoke, but beneath it lay the sharper scent of iron and infection. Rain drummed on the rotted shingles, a sound like distant drums counting down to something neither of them could name. Cale set the sword across the knight's lap. It should have clanged. Instead it settled with a whisper, as if the blade itself feared waking the wounded man. The knight's name was Sir Rowan Hale, though titles felt fragile here. His mail had been cut away, the rings snipped one by one with a shepherd's shears. Beneath, the wound gaped, an ugly mouth that spoke only red. The boy had boiled water, scavenged linen, threaded a needle with tail hair from the dead plow horse outside. Now he knelt, hands shaking not from cold but from the terrible intimacy of touching a stranger's insides. Each stitch drew a hiss through Rowan's teeth, yet the knight never flinched. His eyes, storm gray, the boy saw now, remained fixed on the sword as though it were a compass and he a ship long off course. When the last knot was tied, Cale sat back on his heels. Blood seeped through the linen in slow blossoms. Rowan's fingers found the sword's grip, tracing the worn grooves where countless hands had sworn oaths before. "You returned this," Rowan rasped. His voice was gravel and candle smoke. Cale nodded. Speaking felt dangerous. Words might shatter the fragile hush. Rowan's thumb brushed the hawk etched into the pommel. "Then I owe you more than breath." He tried to push upright, Pain carved new lines across his face. Still, he managed to lift the sword, only an inch, but the movement carried the weight of ceremony. Kneel. The boy's knees obeyed before his mind caught up. Cold earth bit through his threadbare trousers. Firelight painted them both in trembling gold. Name, Rowan demanded. Kale. Son of no one. A ghost of a smile. Names can be remade. Listen close. Outside, thunder rolled like distant siege towers. Inside, the only sound was the wet pull of Rowan's breathing and the soft crackle of pine needles catching flame. By this steel, Rowan said, voice steadying, and by the blood we've shared tonight, I bind my life to yours. When the hawk flies again, it will fly for you. Your village, your fields, under my wing or under my corpse. The words were not loud, yet they filled the barn like smoke. Kale felt them settle in his marrow, heavy and irrevocable. He wanted to protest. He was nobody, a scrawny child with dirt under his nails, but the knight's gaze pinned him silent. Rowan extended the sword. Hilt first. Take it. Kale's fingers closed around leather still warm from the knight's grip. The weight surprised him. It felt less like weapon than promise. Keep it safe, Rowan whispered. One day, I'll come to claim it, and when I do, I'll bring an army. The boy swallowed. His tongue tasted of iron. And if you don't come? Rowan's smile was sharp, almost feral. Then the blade will find me anyway. Steel remembers debts better than men. Silence stretched. Rain slackened to a whisper. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. A sound like a question neither could answer. Rowan's eyes fluttered closed. Exhaustion dragged him under, but his hand remained curled around the boy's wrist, as if anchoring them both to the moment. Kale stayed kneeling long after the knight's breathing leveled into sleep. The sword across his lap caught the last ember glow, reflecting fire and blood and something that might have been hope. When dawn finally seeped through the cracks, pale and uncertain, the boy stood. His legs ached. His heart felt heavier than the blade itself. He wrapped the sword in oilcloth, hid it beneath a loose floorboard, and stepped outside into a world that looked exactly the same, and yet utterly changed. Behind him, the barn still smelled of smoke and iron. Ahead, the road stretched east, toward whatever future the oath had set in motion. 5 winters crusted the thatch before the first tale reached Willowmere. Kale heard it from a peddler whose breath fogged with gin and prophecy. The hawk lives, the man slurred, counting coins on the tavern table. Lost an eye, gained an army. Each coin rang against the scarred wood like a small bell summoning ghosts. The boy, now taller, shoulders broadened by seasons of hauling grain sacks, listened without blinking. He kept the sword beneath a loose plank in the barn. The oilcloth had yellowed, but the blade still caught stray sunbeams like a sleeping star. Sometimes, after evening chores, he lifted it and felt the balance unchanged, as if the oath had kept the steel honest while the world around it bent. Spring brought rumors on the wind. A charcoal burner swore he'd seen black banners at the border passes. The miller's wife spoke of wagons moving north at midnight, wheels muffled with rags. Fields that should have lain fallow were trampled by hooves not our own. The village elders met beneath the oak, voices low, eyes darting toward the road the way deer watch a distant wolf. Kale said nothing. He sharpened scythes at dawn, mended fences at dusk, and listened. Each clang of iron on iron sounded like a question he could not yet answer. Summer bled into drought. Crops withered, and the river shrank until stones showed like knuckles in a clenched fist. Then came the refugees, thin women clutching infants, old men with cracked boots and stories that tasted of smoke. They spoke of a lord who had no name but whose crest was a silver hawk. He burns granaries, one woman whispered, but leaves the houses standing, says grain belongs to the people, not the crown. At night, Kale unwrapped the sword. Moonlight slid along the fuller, and he saw his own face distorted there, older, harder, yet still the boy who had once knelt in blood and firelight. He wondered if the night remembered the barn, the oath, the weight of a promise heavier than any steel. Autumn arrived early, painted in rust and gold. Harvest was poor. The granaries stood half empty. Yet the village square filled with strangers. Ragged soldiers carrying spears whose tips glinted like frost. They wore no uniforms, only the shared look of men who had seen too many winters. Their leader was a woman with a scar that split her eyebrow and a voice like gravel. She spread a map on the tavern table. Red lines for royal patrols, black X's for burned keeps, and at the center, a circle around Willowmere. "They'll come here next," she said. "The king wants grain. The hawk wants justice. Both mean fire." Cale felt the room tilt. He thought of the sword under the plank, of the oath spoken in a barn that smelled of wet straw and death. He thought of Rowan Hale, one-eyed now, perhaps, but still bound by steel and blood. That night he dug up the blade. The cloth fell away, and the hawk on the pommel seemed to watch him with the same storm-gray eyes from years ago. He cleaned it with oil until the barn smelled of cedar and iron. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters like drums. Dawn brought the unmistakable sign, a column of smoke rising from the southern ridge. Not the thin plume of a farmer burning stubble, but a black banner against the pale sky. Beneath it, a horn blast echoed, low, mournful, and triumphant all at once. Cale stood in the doorway, sword across his shoulder, and watched the villagers gather with pitchforks and fear. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the hawk was coming. An army at his back, an oath in his heart, and a blade once returned now waiting to be claimed. The road stretched east, cracked by drought, lined with dying wheat. Cale stepped onto it, boots leaving prints already filling with dust. Behind him, the village held its breath. Ahead, the war that would decide whether promises were stronger than crowns began with the simple sound of marching feet. The siege came at dusk, painted in fire. Royal banners snapped above the ridge, crimson lions on gold, while the village of Willowmere crouched behind its paltry palisade of wagon wheels and sharpened stakes. Smoke curled from the southern fields where wheat had burned for 3 days straight. The wind carried the smell of charred grain and fear. Cale stood on the earthen wall, sword slung across his back beneath a cloak too thin for October. The blade's weight had become part of his spine these past nights, a second conscience pressing between his shoulder blades. Below, torches bloomed like poisonous flowers along the royal line. Somewhere in that constellation of steel and flame rode Rowan Hale, one-eyed hawk, oath-bound killer, savior. The first horn blast rolled down the slope, low and hungry. Arrows followed, black slivers that hissed over the palisade and thudded into thatch. A woman screamed, a child's cry cut off mid-breath. Cale ducked behind the wall, heart hammering so hard he tasted iron. He drew the sword not to fight. He had no skill for war, but because the hawk on the pommel felt warmer than any prayer. Royal infantry advanced in lockstep, shields interlocked like dragon scales. Behind them, siege towers lurched forward on creaking wheels, their maws already glowing with pitch. The villagers, farmers, grandmothers, boys barely taller than scythes, stood with pitchforks and axes, faces pale beneath soot. Cale's neighbor, old Marta, pressed a trembling hand to his arm. "They'll spare none," she whispered. "Grain or no grain." He didn't answer. His gaze snagged on a rider breaking from the royal line. Black cloak, silver hawk stitched over the heart. Torchlight caught the scar that split the rider's eyebrow, the empty socket where an eye had once been. Rowan. For a heartbeat, the battlefield narrowed to 2 points. The knight on his charger, the boy on the wall. Smoke drifted between them like gauze. Rowan raised a gauntlet hand, halt. The advance slowed, confused. Cale stepped into the open. Torchlight licked the length of the blade he carried, turning the fuller into a line of liquid fire. He didn't raise it in threat. He simply let it hang at his side, the way one might display a key. Rowan's remaining eye found the sword. A hush spread outward, ripple by ripple, until the only sound was the crackle of pitch and the wind fingering burned wheat. Soldiers glanced at their commander, unsure whether to notch arrows or kneel. Rowan dismounted. His boots sank in churned mud. The hawk on his cloak seemed to beat once, then still. He walked alone toward the palisade, past the siege tower's hungry mouth, past rows of archers whose bows trembled with held breath. Cale's throat was sand. He wanted to call out, "It's me, the barn, the oath," but words felt too small. Instead he lifted the sword, hilt first, across both palms. Rain hissed against the steel. 10 paces away, Rowan stopped. Torch smoke curled between them, acrid and sweet. The knight's scarred face was unreadable, but his hand, gloved in black leather, hovered over his own empty scabbard as if recognizing a missing limb. Behind Cale a child whimpered. An old man coughed blood into his fist. The village waited beneath the sword's small gleam. Rowan's gauntlet closed around the blade. Not the hilt, but the flat of it, fingers brushing the hawk etched into the steel. A breath passed, another. Then he released the sword, stepped back, and drew a single finger across his throat in a gesture every soldier understood. The siege tower's torches were doused. Bowstrings relaxed. The royal line shifted, uncertain, like wolves hearing a new alpha's growl. Rowan spoke at last, voice carrying just far enough to reach Cale's ears. "No fire tonight." He turned, cloak flaring, and walked back through his own army. Where he passed, men lowered weapons. No one followed the order aloud. None was needed. The hawk had chosen. Cale lowered the sword. His arms shook so violently he nearly dropped it. Behind him, villagers exhaled in a collective rush that sounded like surf after storm. Above the ridge, the royal banners sagged. Rowan mounted his horse, but before wheeling away, he looked once more toward the palisade. Cale couldn't read the expression, grief, maybe, or gratitude, but he saw the scarred brow dip in the smallest of nods. Promise kept, a debt repaid. Then the knight raised his hand again, not in command but farewell, and the army that had come to burn Willowmere melted into the darkness, leaving only the smell of wet earth and the echo of hoofbeats. Cale slid the sword back into its makeshift sling. His palms were blistered, his legs weak, but the blade felt lighter now, as if some weight had passed from steel to soul. In the hush that followed, Marta touched his shoulder. "What did you show him?" Cale looked at the ridge where torches had been, where only stars burned now. "The past," he said, "and the price of forgetting it." Somewhere in the distance, a single hawk cried once, sharp and free, then vanished into the night. Dawn broke soft as butter over Willowmere, and the first sound was not the cock's crow but the quiet scrape of a plowshare biting virgin earth. Cale walked the furrows barefoot, feeling the soil warm between his toes. It clung like memory, dark, willing, alive. Behind him the village stirred. Women hanging linen on lines that still bore scorch marks from last autumn's siege. Children chasing speckled hens through lanes where royal boots had once thundered. The scars were there if you knew where to look. Charred beams, a splintered wagon wheel repurposed as a well cover. But they had become part of the landscape, like river stones smoothed by catastrophe. At the edge of the field stood the sword. It leaned against the split-rail fence, point sunk into loam, pommel catching the low sun. The hawk etched there seemed to watch the planting, fierce and patient. Cale paused beside it, wiped sweat from his brow with the sleeve of a shirt now patched twice over. The blade had not been drawn since the night Rowan Hale turned his army away. It had not needed to be. A shadow fell across the furrow. Rowan himself approached, cloak folded over one arm, the other sleeve pinned neatly where an arm had once ended. The empty socket beneath his brow had healed into a pale seam. The remaining eye carried the same storm, but tempered now, like weather that has spent its fury and remembers mercy. They did not speak at first. Words felt brittle after the year they had endured. Instead Rowan knelt, slowly, joints protesting, pressed 2 fingers into the soil, then lifted them to his lips as if tasting the future. When he rose, his smile was small, crooked, real. "Good ground," he said. Cale nodded. "It remembers blood. It gives back grain." A bell tolled once from the chapel roof, noon marker, not alarm. Children paused mid-chase. A dog barked and was hushed. The sound rolled over the fields like a blessing. From the chapel doorway came Marta, apron bright as clover, carrying a loaf still steaming. Behind her walked the baker, the blacksmith, the widow whose sons had stood on the wall that night with pitchforks. They formed a quiet procession across the field, boots sinking in soft earth, until they made a loose circle around the sword. Marta broke the bread. The crust crackled, releasing the smell of yeast and hearth smoke. She tore it into uneven pieces and passed them hand to hand. No one spoke. The act was prayer enough. When the last crumb disappeared, the blacksmith stepped forward. In his palms lay a new scabbard, oak and leather, tooled with wheat sheaves and the faint outline of a hawk. He offered it to Cale. The boy, no longer a boy, took it, but his gaze went past the scabbard to Rowan. A silent question passed between them. Who keeps the promise now? Rowan answered by drawing the blade, not in threat, but in ceremony. The steel sang once, clear as a lark, then kissed the earth beside the first planted row. He laid the sword down point first, so the crossguard formed a small iron cross. When he straightened, he kept his hand on the pommel. "My debt is paid," he said, voice carrying just enough to reach the circle's edge. "But the oath lives. It is not mine alone anymore." Cale stepped forward. He placed his smaller hand over Rowan's scarred knuckles. Together they pressed the sword deeper, until the hawk touched soil. A hush settled so complete Cale could hear the plowshare cooling behind him, the distant hum of bees waking from winter. Rowan released the grip. He stepped back, turned his face to the sun, and spoke into the wind. Not to the crowd, but to the field itself. "If ever fire comes again, let it find the blade first. If ever children hunger, let the hawk feed them. If ever the crown forgets its people, let this ground remember." The circle murmured amen, though no priest had spoken. Afterward they worked. Cale took the plow handles. Rowan walked alongside, guiding the ox with his good arm, the empty sleeve fluttering like a banner of surrender. Children ran ahead, dropping seed, corn into fresh furrows. Women followed, pressing earth over kernels with bare heels, singing low songs whose words had been forgotten but whose meaning was clear. Grow, endure, return. By dusk the field was planted, the sword stood sentinel, and the bell tolled once more, not for alarm but for supper. They ate beneath the stars. Bread, cheese, the first green onions of spring. Someone produced a skin of cider. Laughter rose, small and bright as sparks. Later, when the moon hung fat and low, Cale walked the fence line alone. The sword caught the light, silver against black earth. He did not touch it. He didn't need to. Its weight had become the weight of the village, the weight of every furrow, every harvest, every child born beneath its shadow. Far off an owl called once, twice, then silence. Cale smiled into the dark. Somewhere beyond the hills Rowan Hale rode patrols he no longer led for pay, but the boundary between their lives had blurred like ink in rain. The oath was no longer a chain. It was a root, deep and quiet, feeding everything that would grow here. He turned back toward the warm glow of windows. Behind him, the sword stood upright in the earth, hawk glinting, a promise kept in silence. An abandoned thing no longer abandoned, a life spared now guarding the living. And in the hush before sleep, the field itself seemed to breathe. A slow, steady pulse beneath the stars, beating the same rhythm as the heart that had once knelt in blood and straw, and now walked free beneath an unburned sky.